Hey everyone, this is Daniel, and since this is my first video, I just decided to introduce myself a little bit. I thought that it could be a good opportunity to show myself and to tell a little bit about the project. So I created this channel because I love art in general, I love writing, I love photography. I have my Instagram below in the description where you can check my travel photos. But I created this channel because I think it's another way that I can create art and express myself. The idea here is that we explore cities together and to visit places where I travel, always with the camera and with the story. This first one is going to be more historic. I don't think it's going to be always like this. I think I can explore thoughts, reflections, and a whole other variety of topics. Please, if you like this video, subscribe below, and also don't forget to leave your feedback. It's going to be very important for me since I'm just starting. But anyway, without any further ado, let's go to the first one. To tell the story of how Washington, D.C. became the capital of the United States, we need to go back in time. Way back when there was no United States at all. Before there was a nation, there were just 13 separate colonies, each with its own government, laws, and interests. They were not yet a united country, they were simply individual states, loosely connected under the British rule. While I was doing the research for this video, I realized that it was gonna be impossible to understand why and how the United States capital was created without first understanding the struggle for the United States independence. The political, the social, and the economic forces that shaped the birth of a new nation. This story begins long before the city of Washington was built. It starts with a fight for representation, for rights, and for a new identity that would break free from the British crown. Only by understanding that struggle can we see why the capital had to be more than just a city. It had to be a symbol of unity, compromise, and a new federal government rising from the chaos of 13 competing states. Out of the many events that happened at the time, I thought that the Stamp Act was a good starting point. And that happened in 1765. It was a key moment that set the stage for the American Revolution. In that year, the Stamp Act made colonists to be required to buy a special government issue stamp on a wide range of printed materials. This wasn't just about imported goods anymore. This was a direct tax inside the colonies. Newspapers, legal documents, licenses, and even playing cards. Every item needed a stamp proof of tax payment. This hit the colonies hard. It was an obvious attempt by Britain to raise revenue from its American colonies, but without giving those colonies any say in the decision. And by colonies here, I obviously mean those who lived in the colonies at the time. The response was swift and fierce. Colonies organized boycotts of British goods. Towns erupted in protests, sometimes turning violent. No taxation without representation became the battle cry. The colonists argued that since they had no representatives in the British Parliament, it was unfair and illegal to tax them directly. This idea of self-government and local autonomy started to take root. This was one of the first major sparks in the fight for colonial rights. The British government eventually repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, hoping to calm the unrest, but the victory was short-lived. That same year, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. It was a statement of power, declaring that Parliament had the full authority to make laws and impose taxes on the colonies, whether or not the colonies had any representation. This only deepened the resentment and mistrust between the colonies and Britain, setting the stage for more conflicts to come. So in summary, the relevance of the Stamp Act, and the reason why I chose it to be the starting point of this video, is because it spurred one of the first conversations about states' autonomy. Now, let's jump a couple years, around 8 years. In 1773, The British government was trying to rescue the struggling British East India Company, a massive trading company that was drowning in debt. And when I say massive, it's because it was really huge, probably one of the biggest companies in humankind history relative to its own time. But anyway, the Tea Act allowed this company to sell its tea directly to the American colonies, cutting out the middleman, which meant the tea was actually cheaper than before. So, sounds like a good deal, right? Cheaper tea for the colonists? Not quite. The problem was that the Tea Act kept the existing British tax on tea, the tax that colonies had already protested against. By accepting this tea, the colonists would be acknowledging Britain's right to tax them without their consent. Beyond that, the Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly. It squeezed out colonial merchants and smugglers who had been importing tea from the Dutch and others. Many colonies saw this as an economic warfare disguised as a price cut. Tensions boiled over in December of 1773 when a group of colonists in Boston boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston harbor, which accounted for roughly 46 tons of tea. This event, known as the Boston Tea Party, was a bold act of defiance. In 1774, Britain responded to the Boston Tea Party with a series of harsh laws called the Coercive Acts, called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. These laws were designed to punish Massachusetts and send a clear message to the other colonies. First, they closed Boston Harbor, cutting off trade and strangling the city's economy until the destroyed tea was paid for. Next, they took direct control of Massachusetts government, replacing the elected leaders with royal appointees loyal to the crown. The act also allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried back in England or Canada, where they were more likely to get off easy. And they expanded the Quartering Act, forcing colonies to house British soldiers in their homes even without their consent. To the colonies, these laws were not just punishments, they were direct assaults on their rights and freedoms. In response, leaders from the colonies called the First Continental Congress in 1774, a meeting to coordinate resistance and figure out their next steps. Now, it's important to understand that the Continental Congress of 1774 wasn't really a government, not yet. It was more like a crisis meeting, a gathering of colonial leaders coming together to respond to the escalating pressure from Britain, especially after the Intolerable Acts. At this Congress, delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia being the only holdout, wrote a document called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This declaration argued that the colonies were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen back in Britain. Among those rights was a firm rejection of taxation without representation, the very core of their protest. They also agreed to take action. They called for a boycott of British goods, no imports, no exports, and no consumption of British products. To enforce this, they created the Continental Association, a network meant to coordinate and monitor the boycott across the colonies. Importantly, they didn't yet declare independence. Most delegates still hoped for a peaceful resolution, a return to negotiation with the crown. In any case, they agreed to meet again in 1775 if things didn't improve. And as you can probably tell, they didn't. So, that second meeting would become the Second Continental Congress, setting the stage for the next phase of the conflict. By 1775, tensions that had been simmering for years finally exploded into open rebellion. The first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The shot heard around the world. From that moment on, the colonies were at war with Britain. Early fighting focused mainly in Massachusetts, where local militias faced off against British troops. Amid the chaos, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Washington wasn't just a skilled military leader, he was a unifying figure, someone who could bring together the diverse and divided colonies under a common cause. And I thought that this was a very important fact, the fact that George Washington was appointed as the chief of the Continental Army, because obviously he was a very important figure in the creation of Washington, D.C. So, in the next year, in 1776, the colonies took a bold step. They declared their independence from Britain. The Declaration of Independence wasn't a plan for a government, it was a statement, a clear message to the world saying, "We're breaking away." At this point, there was no national president, no strong federal government, and no power at all from this government, quote unquote. Instead, the 13 colonies operated more like 13 separate states, loosely connected and trying to coordinate a war effort. They faced enormous challenges. They had to organize armies, manage resources, and build alliances, all without a centralized authority to guide them. Despite these difficulties, the declaration marked the beginning of a new nation, one built on the idea of self rule and liberty. 5 years later, around 1781, the newly independent states realized they needed a framework to work together. So that framework was the Articles of Confederation, the actual first constitution of the United States. Drafted in 1777 and finally ratified in 1781, the Articles aimed to create a unified government for the 13 states during and after the Revolutionary War. But there was a catch. The states had just fought to break free from a powerful monarchy, so they were really afraid of any strong central authority. The Articles reflected that fear. They deliberately preserved the state sovereignty, giving most power to the individual states rather than the national government. The new country officially got its name here during the Articles of Confederation, the United States of America. But the Articles left the national government weak. There was no national president to lead the country, Congress had no power to tax and no authority to enforce laws, and states operated almost like independent countries, loosely cooperating but still often pulling in different directions. This fragile system worked only just enough to keep the states loosely connected, but it set the stage for bigger problems down the road. In 1783, 2 years later, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the Revolutionary War. Britain finally recognized the United States as an independent nation. But independence brought its own set of challenges. The new country was free, yes, but it was deeply fragmented. Massive war debt weighed heavily on the states. Trade was chaotic because each state printed its own money, leading to confusion and instability. There was no unified currency to bind the economy together. People were in debt and growing increasingly dissatisfied with the government's inability to manage these problems. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to tax, meaning it couldn't raise money to pay its bills or veterans of the war. This failure to pay soldiers and creditors revealed serious flaws in the young government. One of the most alarming events highlighting this weakness was the Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising by Massachusetts farmers protesting high taxes and harsh economic conditions. The rebellion exposed the dangers of too much decentralization. The federal government was too weak to respond effectively. George Washington, who had retired from public life, was so concerned by the unrest that he agreed to come back and preside over the Constitutional Convention in 1787. It became clear that the Articles of Confederation were failing, and something had to be done to save the fragile Union. This crisis paved the way for the drawing of a new constitution, one that would create a strong federal government and a more stable nation. In 1787, leaders from across the states gathered in Philadelphia for what became known as the Constitutional Convention. James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton attended that meeting. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, other famous figures of the time, were absent, serving as diplomats abroad. And a fun fact is that Rhode Island was the only state that refused to send delegates. The original goal of the Constitutional Convention was simple: to revise the Articles of Confederation and fix its weaknesses. But very quickly it became clear that tweaking the old system wouldn't work. They needed a completely new plan, a new government. After weeks of debate and negotiation, they created a blueprint for a stronger, more unified nation. Some of the key outcomes of the Articles of Confederation included the creation of three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. This separation of powers was designed to prevent any branch from becoming too powerful. A system of checks and balances ensured each branch could limit the others. The legislative branch was divided into two parts: the House of Representatives and the Senate. Representation in the House was based on population, favoring larger states, but the Senate gave every state two senators, no matter the size. This compromise balanced power between big and small states, giving smaller states veto power on legislation. And finally, a stronger federal government with the authority to tax, raise armies, regulate trade between states, and enforce laws nationwide. Despite these advances, many tensions remained unresolved. Issues like slavery, which wouldn't be abolished until 1865, states' rights, and debts continued to fuel political debate and division. Still, the Constitution was a bold step toward creating a lasting framework for the United States. It was signed in 1787, ratified by the state in 1788, and fully accepted by all 13 states by 1790. This new constitution laid the foundation for the federal government and set the stage for the capital city's eventual creation. By 1788 and 1789, the new constitution was in place, and the country was ready for its first presidential election. George Washington was the clear choice. He was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. John Adams, having received the second most votes, became the vice president. Washington took office in April of 1789, stepping into a role that had never existed before. There were no real opponents. People saw Washington as the one man who could unite the young nation. After all, he was the hero of the revolution, the general who led the fight for independence and earned the trust of people. Ironically, Washington didn't want the job. He was reluctant to leave his peaceful life at Mount Vernon and take on the enormous responsibilities of leading a brand new government. But in the end, he accepted it, understanding the importance of his role in shaping the future of the United States. So finally, after the Constitution was adopted, the new federal government faced a critical question: where should the nation's capital be? They needed a neutral, central location, one that wasn't tied to any single state or seen as favoring one region over another. This wasn't a simple decision. For 7 years, members of Congress debated, negotiated, and wrestled with the idea of what the capital should be. They were trying to define what a federal enclave meant: a district that belonged to the federal government alone, separate from any state. The final choice was the result of a major compromise in 1790. Behind closed doors, what some call a backroom dinner deal, the leaders struck the deal balancing financial and political interests. Alexander Hamilton, representing the North, wanted the federal government to assume the huge state debts accumulated during the Revolutionary War. Massachusetts, for example, was deeply in debt. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both Virginians and leaders of the South, had a different view. They opposed Hamilton's plan, but they agreed to it on one condition: that the capital moved south, closer to Virginia. This would give the southern states influence over the new government seat and symbolize a balance between the North and South. At the time, Having a capital near the southern states meant that they could actually influence what was happening in the new capital. So the compromise satisfied both sides. The result was the Funding Act and the Residence Act, laws that reshaped the country's financial system and established a permanent federal district along the Potomac River. This deal laid the foundation for what would become Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. Now, going over these two laws, the Funding Act, at its core, asked the federal government to take out all the Revolutionary War debts, over $21 million, dollars, which at the time was an insane amount of money that the individual states had accumulated. This was a huge step. Before this, each state was responsible for paying its own debts, which created chaos and uncertainty. Hamilton's idea was to unify these debts under one federal system. To manage this debt, the government would issue federal bonds. These bonds promised payment with interest, giving investors confidence they would get their money back. By doing this, Hamilton created a centralized, unified public credit system. This wasn't just about money. It was about building trust with foreign governments and investors, as well as within the country. If the United States wanted to be taken seriously on the world stage and grow economically, it needed a reliable financial system. The Funding Act laid the foundation for the modern US financial system. It made clear that the federal government could raise funds, pay debts, and support the nation's growth. Without this, the young country might have struggled to survive economically. Now, going over the other law, the Residence Act was backed by key Southern leaders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who saw the location of the capital as a major political issue. The act created a federal district no larger than 10 miles by 10 miles along the Potomac River, nestled between Maryland and Virginia. This federal district was to serve as a permanent seat of the US government. Importantly, the framers understood that the capital could not belong to any one state. It had to be a federal city, controlled by the national government alone, to ensure neutrality and prevent any single state from having undue influence. President George Washington was given the power to select his exact site within the designated area. The location obviously wasn't chosen at random. It had strategic advantages, and it was close to two established port towns, Georgetown, which today is Georgetown, the neighborhood of Washington, D.C., and Alexandria. Both were important for trade, especially since the site was accessible to ocean-going ships via the Potomac. George Washington famously called the site the gateway to the interior. He hoped that the capital would serve more than just a political role. He wanted it to connect and economically bind the growing western territories to the young nation's heart. While the federal city was being planned and built, a process that would take nearly a decade, the capital temporarily moved from New York to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia served as the nation's capital from 1790 to 1800, hosting the government while the new city took shape. So, in summary, these two laws helped to create a strong federal government, both financially and politically. They set the stage for the rise of partisan politics, the development of Washington, D.C. as a symbol of compromise, and the creation of modern US financial system. Now that we finally understood how Washington, D.C. was created, I brought some other facts here from the city which I found it was curious and interesting. And the first one was that Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, the name Columbia was commonly used during the Revolutionary War as a patriotic symbol for the United States, drawing from Christopher Columbus's legacy. And this is debated by some, but I see that many people relate it to Christopher Columbus. It was an early way Americans expressed their identity before the capital city fully took shape. To design the new capital, the government appointed Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French engineer and architect, to lay out the city's plan. L'Enfant envisioned a grand, orderly grid system with wide avenues and public spaces, centering around the Capitol building, a symbol of the nation's democratic ideals. However, despite his ambitious vision, L'Enfant was dismissed in 1792 due to conflicts with government officials and disagreements over the project. His work was later taken up by Andrew Ellicott, who simplified and refined the original plan. Although some of L'Enfant's grand ideas were never realized immediately, many elements of his design eventually shaped the capital's iconic layouts, and you can still see them to this day. By November 1800, the capital was ready enough for President John Adams to move into the White House. In that same month, Congress convened for the first time in the unfinished Capitol building. The 1800 census recorded just over 8,000 residents within the District of Columbia, with about 69% identifying as white, which I thought was interesting since you can see the great diversity that exists in the city today. Despite its new status, the city was far from fully developed. Many dwellings were unfinished and amenities were scarce, making life challenging for those who had moved to the capital in its earliest days. Just over a decade later, during the War of 1812, Washington D.C. became a battlefield. After American forces invaded what is now Toronto, British troops retaliated by invading the capital and setting fire to major buildings, including the White House, the Capitol, and the Library of Congress. This attack destroyed not only physical structures, but also the city's fledgling governmental infrastructure. In the aftermath, Thomas Jefferson personally helped rebuild the library's collection by selling his own extensive personal library for nearly 24 grand in 1815, showing the commitment to restoring the nation's cultural foundation. In 1847, a significant change occurred when the portion of the capital originally ceded by Virginia, including Alexandria, was returned or retroceded after voters in Alexandria felt neglected in terms of development compared to the Maryland side of the city. This shrinking of the federal district shaped Washington's modern boundaries. The Civil War marked another period of growth for Washington, D.C. As the nations fought to end slavery, the city played a central role. People who were enslaved in the district were emancipated on April 16, 1862, months before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued nationwide. This early emancipation turned the capital into a hub for free enslaved people, fostering a vibrant African American community that included leaders like Frederick Douglass. To protect the city during the Civil War, a large military presence was established, and the federal government expanded rapidly around the wartime administration, settling the stage for Washington's continuing importance as the nation's political and social center. To conclude, Washington D.C. wasn't chosen by accident. It was the product of compromise, strategy, and vision. A city created to represent not just power, but unity. A place that satisfied both Northern and Southerns, that anchored a fragile new nation between its rival regions. George Washington may have seen it as the gateway to the interior, but in time it became something more. The symbolic heart of a republic still finding its way.
Good.